And good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we're looking at the conflation, the joining, if you please, of Joel chapter 2 and 3 with Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Because Joel foretold the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the last days before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. At the great and terrible day of the Lord would gather all nations to judgment. Matthew chapter 25 predicted the coming of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord, of Christ, at the time of the gathering of the nations. So as I said yesterday, unless you are willing to say that there's going to be two great and terrible day of the Lords for the gathering of the nations, then these are parallel texts. And so what I began to show yesterday was that God promised in Joel that he would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. And he said, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall prophesy. So God said, in the last days, before the great and the terrible day of the Lord said, I will show wonders in heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Well, look, the prophesying was part of the signs. The speaking in tongues of Acts chapter 2 was part of the sign. We'll have more to say about that later. And so, as I pointed out yesterday, if it is true that the charismatic gifts were to be a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, and if we do not have living, inspired, infallible prophets living and active in the church today as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, that means the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord has occurred. That means Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following has been fulfilled, which of course means the Olivet Discourse is not divided. It's not split up into two different subjects. Here's something rather amazing, okay? Men such as Kenneth Gentry argues that Matthew chapter 24 and 25 are to be divided. Matthew 24, 4 to 35 or 36 is talking about the events of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, leading up to it and consummating in the Lord's coming in a spiritual manner in AD 70. However, Mr. Gentry is adamant that when Jesus said, Matthew 24, verse 36, but of that day and hour knows no man, he changes the subject. He's no longer talking about the events of the first century. He's talking about some proposed end of time. But wait a minute. Hang on here. Kenneth Gentry believes that the gift of prophecy, the time of living, infallible, inspired, authoritative prophets has ceased. He has engaged Robert Grudem, I believe it's Robert, isn't it? Who is a believer in the charismatic gifts, including prophecy. And Kenneth Gentry argues against that view. Kenneth Gentry says, there are no living prophets today. Well, wait a minute. Joel 2, Acts chapter 2. I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. And the prophesying, along with the charismatic gifts of tongues, etc., healings, miracles, what have you, were to serve as signs of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. So, Kenneth Gentry says, okay, miracles have ended. We don't have tongues anymore. We don't have the gift of prophecy anymore. But the great and terrible day of the Lord, of which those miraculous outpourings of the Spirit were for, That day hasn't come. You catch the power of that, ladies and gentlemen? Kenneth Gentry's view, in other words, breaks the bond between a sign and that which it signified. Now, I know this is kind of a trite illustration, but let's imagine that you're driving along in the middle of absolute teetotal nowhere, and there's a stop sign. 2 years ago, my wife and I went to Santa Fe, New Mexico, in Estes Park to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary. Yeah, that's almost 3 years ago. Wow. And our GPS said we had to take a detour. Well, the detour happened to be 250 miles long. We were in the middle of absolute nowhere. We would literally drive for 50 or 60 miles and not see another car. We wouldn't see a house. We wouldn't see anything or anybody. So let's imagine that out there in the middle of this absolute nowhere, not close to any kind of a side road, and believe you me, there were no side roads. So no side roads, no intersections. They're just a sign that says stop. Now, what do we normally think when we see a stop sign? Well, we know that very soon, shortly, quickly, there's going to be a reason to stop. Likewise, ladies and gentlemen, there is a temporal connection between a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord and the occurrence of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. That's why the New Testament writers, all of whom possess the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, spoke of the coming of the day of the Lord as coming soon, shortly, quickly, in a very, very little while. They knew, they realized, just as Joel had predicted, that the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit were a sign of the impending, at hand, quickly, shortly, coming soon, in a very, very little while day of the Lord. They knew those miracles were a sign of that impending, imminent day of the Lord. There is no indication whatsoever that those charismatic gifts were to be a sign of something that would not and has not occurred for 2,000 years. That's why Paul could say, writing to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 4 to 8, that he praised God and thanked God for their faithfulness, for their love, and their patience as they waited for the coming of the day of the Lord. And he said, you come behind in no gift, waiting for the day of the Lord. You have been confirmed in your faith through the gifts, and those gifts would continue to confirm them until the end. Ladies and gentlemen, the Corinthians are not alive today, but they were to possess the gifts of the Holy Spirit until the day of the Lord. Since the Corinthians, which were part of the generation of Acts chapter 2, since the Corinthians possessed the gifts had confirmed them, were confirming them, would continue to confirm them until the day of the Lord. That is perfectly consistent with Acts chapter 2, in which Peter said that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was to serve as signs of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And now watch this. Peter, after telling that audience that the miraculous occurrence of that day was the beginning of the fulfillment of Joel and was serving as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. You know, the time of the gathering of the nations. Peter said, save yourselves from this untoward generation. He didn't say to save themselves from some future generation. He said what you have seen, what you have heard, what you have witnessed this day is the fulfillment of Joel, who said that in the last days the Spirit would be poured out as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Save yourselves from this generation. You know, I honestly do not know, ladies and gentlemen, how much clearer language could be. So once again, the events of Acts chapter 2 were to serve as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, the time of the gathering of the nations for judgment. But Peter said, save yourselves from this untoward generation, which, by the way, is a citation of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 5 and following, which was a prophecy of Israel's last days, not the last days of time, not the last days of the Christian age. Peter was speaking to those Jews, quoting a prophecy of Israel's last days, quoting a prophecy of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, and he told them, save yourselves from this generation. Just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 to 8, the Corinthians possessed the gifts, the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit, who had confirmed them, which were confirming them, which would continue to confirm them until the day of the Lord. The great and terrible day of the Lord would occur in their lifetime, not generations later. And this brings us back once again to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. All of these references to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit as a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the great day of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25, 31 was to be and was in the first century generation, meaning that the Olivet Discourse cannot be divided. You cannot take the position like Kenneth Gentry does, ladies and gentlemen, and claim that Matthew chapter 25, 31 is an end of time event, when it's based upon Joel chapter 2, which was a prediction of the first century great and terrible day of the Lord. Sorry, it just doesn't work. Hey, I'm out of time. Don't forget, tomorrow, on Friday, I will continue our examination of why N.T. Wright is wrong on the redemption of creation. You do not want to miss it, so I'll see you on the flip side.